Go ahead, ask what you wanted to
Great,
do.
great
Sorry.
art is also didactic in its way, and that is something that is a strain throughout your work. I was just going to mention two things. The gorgeous George Cash's clay interaction. I swear I've read that in one of your books.
Probably,
Um,
yeah.
but where he gave that exact advice, but perhaps it's one of those things where it's doubled in my mind and can't even been embroidered. The other thing is I've never understood Jessica's obsession with the Japanese writers. I read Kawabata as an example during Christmas and Snow Country and a few other of his books, and it was one of those things where this is clearly good, but as compared to a great writer like Lauren Isley, it's not up to the same standard.
Well, Jessica is better than those writers. She takes
Yeah,
some of the techniques that she learned from there. I was looking through some of the books because what I was doing is I was looking for example, this is and this is a good example. Uh, I was looking for basically the starts of my chapters, how to start the chapters interestingly. So I have in a lot of the chapters, I have 75 or 80% of the bulk. And I'm looking for an interesting way to start the chapter. So I was looking through, like, Junichiro Tanizaki is one of Jessica's favorite writers, I think. So I was looking through some of his short stories. And I was looking at, and I might see a sentence that I'll take and play off of, and then I'll write 2 or 3 paragraphs based off of one sentence because it puts me in a certain mind frame. It's like dipping your paintbrush into a certain paint and then just adding a few streaks of purple, say in a sunset painting, and it totally changes something. This is what I mean when I talk about stealing. I'm not plagiarizing Tanizaki, but I'm taking a few words of his and I'll use maybe those words. Let's say I write 300-word introduction or start of a chapter or 500 words or something. I'll just take 3 or 4 words that give me the spur and it gives me the into it. And so that's the way that you use other literature and to
yeah.
learn
Me
it.
and Alex Sherman were speaking about that the other night, where he was discussing how he could read a very bad book and he could see this image of a box or a puzzle or something, and he could take that even as the writing itself is horrid. And that's similar to how I read, where I can find how a certain author describes an insect and everything around it is terrible prose or terrible poetry, but that image may be something that can be reworked and expanded upon in a better work that I could write.
Yeah.
The other thing too I want to mention, just as a general aside before we start talking about before we close True Life, is the influence of world cinema on your work. Since we're talking about the different cultures and whatnot, um, do you think that I know that we've mentioned how La Dolce Vita and a few things from De Angelopoulos may have had some similarities to True Life, but after writing True Life, you got into more world cinema. Has that taken any kind of influence over your work? And also, what are the differences you find between the American filmmakers, like the great American filmmakers like Scorsese and Wells and Kubrick and Allen, compared to some of the European filmmakers and especially the Japanese New Wave?
Well, if you've read the first 200 or 300 pages of a Norwegian, you've already seen the influence of
Yeah,
film. I mean, you know,
I want you to elaborate upon it for the
yeah.
viewers.
Well, I mean, that book, I said, is a dark comedy, and it's the whole structure of the book is filmic. It's filmic in the fact that the book is a found manuscript, which is taken directly from Steppenwolf. If you've ever read Steppenwolf by Hermann Hesse, the main narrative of the book is that someone finds this manuscript left by the Steppenwolf, this guy who thinks he's a werewolf. Uh, and in a similar fashion, we find out in A Norwegian in the Family that uh, the interior book is actually from a manuscript written by Manny Cole called The Norwegian in a Family, not A Norwegian in a Family. So uh, there we get the play of perspective. We get trailers and teaser trailers that start to open that book. Then we get then we get
Intermissions.
the intermissions later on. We get the overture. Uh, at the end of the book, as I said, I have screen credits that you have to read through because once you finish the end of the novel, the book doesn't end. The novel ends, and then the book goes on, and then the book ends. So there's a difference between there's the novel. It's sort of like The Norwegian in the Family by Manny Cole is the novel, but the book contains the novel. The book, A Norwegian in the Family with Dan Schneider, contains that, and the book doesn't end where the novel ends. So that's just something to keep in mind as you read that. But yeah, and there are lots of filmic moments. You mentioned a few of them. I think I mentioned earlier. There's a great scene later in the book where Paulie Maravelli has someone tracking the Norwegian, and he and his and we're seeing the Norwegian. The interesting thing is the great scene is Bit von Rheingold is having one of his film premieres. It's one of his straight films, his non-porno films in the late '60s, and for some reason the Norwegian is tracking Bit von Rheingold, and he's lusting after Bit von Rheingold's European babe, Monica something or other. I call it sort of loosely based on a Monica Vitti kind of character, and Bit sees the Norwegian. He thinks he's a guy named Phil Thompson. For some reason, Bit thinks that the Norwegian is named Phil Thompson. And so we see the Norwegian follow Bit. And as the movie is playing, we see the Norwegian go into a park and sits down, and he's in this park opposite from the theater, and he's watching it. And then we sort of pan back from the Norwegian, and we hear the word sort of something like cut. And then we see that what we've been seeing is actually a film that Paulie Maravelli has one of his guys playing, and they finally have found out who the Norwegian is. They don't know his name, but now they know what he looks like. They know who he is, and they know he's the Norwegian. And this is how Paulie gets a hold of the Norwegian, which then leads to Big Frank turning the Norwegian against Paulie. And so there's the classic technique that's used in a number of films where we're watching something and we don't know that it's a film, or we don't know until we hear the word cut or something, or Paulie says turn on the lights or something. And so I do that in the book. And most often you hear people talking about films that have been influenced by books, and books that have been turned into films and whatnot. But why couldn't you do the reverse? Why couldn't I can tell you that more so than contemporary writing, and even more so than the classic great novels of the last 300 or 400 years, films of the 20th century, and especially the foreign films that I've seen, have certainly influenced my writing more in giving you different ways of having perspective. So in terms of that influence, yeah, that's certainly there, and it's also there in certain other works too. The subversion of a lot of tropes. My Western book that you haven't read yet too takes a lot of tropes from Western books, but also from Western films, and turns them on its head too. What was the second part of the question about films in general, though?
The general difference between great American filmmakers like
Oh,
Scorsese, Wells, Kubrick, and Allen compared to the European greats and Japanese New Wave.
well, someone like Woody Allen, Scorsese. I don't, he often talks about having watched some films from some of the Italian neorealist masters, and while there are some vague similarities, the tone of the films are so much different that just because you have a pan of a camera in Mean Streets or in Goodfellas that vaguely resembles something in a Fellini film, uh, it isn't really that much of an influence. Woody Allen certainly did take some Fellini and Bergman, but he generally improved on the things that he took. Um, uh, Orson Welles was someone who is sort of a jack of all trades. He was, in many ways, he could make a great film for more different ways than anyone did, without money, working over 10 or 15 years. The European filmmakers, I think, had the backing of their governments. A lot of the film companies were nationalized, even in Western Europe. So it was less dependent upon even big backers like a Dino De Laurentiis. Cinecittà, the Italian film mecca in the mid 20th century, was still something that I think was founded by the fascists when Mussolini was in power. All of Bergman's films were funded by Svensk Film Industry, which was, I think, funded by the Swedish government. Even the Japanese film companies, which I don't think were funded by the government, were much more director-oriented. Kurosawa and Ozu and Mizoguchi and Kobayashi and the great 60s Japanese film directors all were thought of as the primary artists, whereas most directors in Hollywood studio system were artists for hire. It wasn't until Wells broke away and had to become an independent in a sense, and then Cassavetes did that. Then John Sayles, did that, following up on them. Woody Allen and Kubrick had enough success that they could, within the system, be the de facto independents. But so I think the Europeans generally had a much easier time getting their quote unquote vision on screen because they had the backing of their governments and the backing of the film industries that recognized that they were artists. This is one of the great things that is wrong with American culture, is that we don't value the arts. Now, I've said that it shouldn't, that the government, American government, shouldn't fund the arts, and I still believe that. But I think that there should be ways to facilitate rich people from individually funding individuals. Let's say, for example, if someone came along and found Cosmoetica or my YouTube channel and said, Dan, I've been impressed with your. Maybe they couldn't recognize I was a great poet or a great writer, but you're doing great things with your interviews. You're enlivening the discussion out there. I want to fund you. Well, the government should allow for that, and should people should be able to do tax write-offs. And I think that's a better funding way to get great art out there, because and I said this before. Jessica and I, no matter what we've accomplished, it's only going to be a portion of what we could have accomplished had we not had the day-to-day worries of feeding ourselves, and if we get injured, having to go to a hospital or something, to take that kind of worry away. But again, it also has to be something on a string. You can't just give someone a 20-year free ride and they don't produce. Maybe they produce for the first 3, 4, 5 years, but then 15 years they're not doing. No, you have to have those carrots hanging out there. And certainly, to a certain degree, even those industries, those film industries in countries, were still expecting to make some money. It wasn't the primary thing, but it would be good to at least break even. So Kurosawa lost a lot of backing later on in his career. He sort of fell out of favor after Redbeard, his '65 film, which is a great film. So that's the basic difference between the world filmmakers that I've seen. It's not so much their world approach or their philosophy, so much it is that they had a lot more support to get out whatever it is they wanted to get out.
Do you think that the Americans at their best are roughly comparable to them artistically? Because I would certainly agree that they were.
Well, yeah, certainly. I mean, you can. I mean, I said how I thought La Dolce Vita is probably the greatest film because it's great in the most ways of any film that I've ever seen. But 2001, is as close to a perfect and great film as you can get. It's greatly acted, greatly written. It is tender. It is deep. These people who think it's boring, you're a fucking idiot. You're a fucking idiot. Jessica and I laughed at this one guy who did this YouTube video, landscape.
Oh, I remember.
Yeah, when you see the jungle animals, or then you see them going to, and you go, it takes 4 minutes and 38 seconds for them to get from one moon base to the other base. But look at what you're getting there, the scenery. Look at what it's setting up there. Or the scene where the pen is floating about or whatnot, which was used simply by gluing a pen onto a see-through piece of glass and just turning it ingeniously in front of the camera.
People like that are, in a way, I mean, you can destroy them in argument, but they're unhelpable.
Yeah.
I also want you to mention, since we're on a track on films, who out of the newest discoveries of foreign filmmakers has impressed you the most, or can you boil it down to one?
Out of all foreign filmmakers?
Out of all foreign filmmakers that you've seen.
Oh, I mean, certainly, I think Kurosawa was the most diverse that I've seen. Koba, it gets back to the idea I've often said about, I have a certain few saws that I hang out. I talk about my 3 intellects theory, which when I get to creativity, I'll talk about that. Functionary, creationary, visionary, and most of these great filmmakers would be at least in the creationary, but most of the best ones are certainly visionary to a certain extent. And then I talk about quality, quantity, and diversity. And diversity probably encompasses Kurosawa the most, because when you think about it, Bergman basically had uh, either a few lighthearted comedies early on, and then he had his period where he was doing these sort of dour, uh, very experimental films in the '60s throughout the most of the '70s. Um, but Kurosawa, a lot of people say, well, he all he did was the historical films and the modern films, but the if you look at something like Kurosawa from his main period of 1950 to 65, if you look at, I think I've seen all of his films in that 15-year golden period of Kurosawa, with the exception of The Lower Depths. So he did, I think, 13 or 14 films there. I've seen all but one. Um, Rashomon uh, is set, in ancient times. It's got the great four different viewpoints. It has the terrible ending, which I'm doing a Kurosawa show this Sunday. I'm going to have to mention that. It has that terrible ending, but other than that, he didn't make that mistake again. Most of the rest of his endings are great. Then he has Akiru, which you have the main story, and then the second half of the film, or the last 40%, is the people talking about the main character, which is very daring. Then he does Seven Samurai, which is his most complex. There's the most character development in that film. It's a great film. But it's also an action film that developed a lot of action tropes that are used around the world. Then he does something like The Hidden Fortress, which is a comic film, which is always talked about as a template for Star Wars. But it's obviously much better film than Star Wars. But it's a really good film. Then he does Throne of Blood, which is probably his weakest film of those in that period that I saw, but it still got some memorable moments. Then he did The Lower Depths, which I didn't see. Then he does a modern film again with The Bad Sleepwalker, which has one of the most chilling endings of all time. This old man who's a lackey of the vice president of a company, who's just killed off the main character played by Mifune. Imagine a Hollywood film where in the end you kill off Tom Cruise or George Clooney or Brad Pitt, and and you don't suffer any consequences as the bad guy. Well, that's what this film does, and it's a brilliant takedown of corporations and corporate evil. Then he goes on. He does Yojimbo and Sanjuro, which are lesser films. They're comic films, but they are so well made that you can overlook some of the lightness and the frothiness of it. Then he comes back. He does High and Low, which is, I think, probably his best film that I've seen. It's very Shakespearean. Again, broken into two distinct halves: the initial crime, and then the aftermath, where we follow this criminal that we don't ever really find out about. He's someone who just randomly picked this crime to do, and there's no lesson to be learned, and it ends with the great confrontation between Mifune and the criminal, and then the blinds come down, and the guy is just a lunatic. And then the last one there is Redbeard, which is a great overlooked film that again does a lot of interesting things with human psyche. And then he had two really excellent films towards the end of his career: Kagamushi in 1980, which is a historical film, and it's better than Ron, which usually is thought of as better. Ron is almost like a fairy tale kind of film, but the plenum of these great films that he did, and even some of the earlier films that I saw, a couple of his films like Stray Dog before Rashomon, he was always trying to do something different, and that's something that I'd have to say, probably, even though Kurosawa isn't my favorite filmmaker, he's not even my favorite Japanese filmmaker, it would be hard to argue against him as probably the greatest filmmaker that I've seen. Antonioni, in his greatest films, is certainly there. I just rewatched Il Grido, the film he did before he went into his famous modernist period. It was his sort of last neo-realist film, and that's a very good film, near-great film, I'd say. So there's a lot of things there. Kubrick, he has 7 films that can be put against anyone. Wells did more with less than anyone that I know of. Cassavetes' top 3 films are as great as anything, and I think The Killing of a Chinese Bookie, you could make an argument that could be the greatest American film. It's certainly the greatest American film that's about real life and real people that I've ever seen. Woody Allen, Crimes and Misdemeanors, Stardust Memories, Another Woman, his his three greatest films. He's got maybe 5, 6, 7 other great films as well. So I mean, yeah, I mean these are all filmmakers that are well within the canon of great filmmaking. Even Charlie Chaplin and some
What
of his
about Werner Herzog?
yeah, his early stuff there. And speaking of Ingmar Bergman, though, Herzog is a guy who has no fucking clue about films outside of his own stuff, and even his own films, he doesn't seem to recognize it. And you don't know whether that's part of his shtick or whether he really means it.
Yeah. I would put him up there with them at his best, but he has had, I think, an even worse decline in these last few years than Alan and Scorsese have.
Yeah.
Especially with these documentaries. There was one about texting that was just an abominable film.